Crystal Night, so called because of all the glass broken in Jewish homes, in synagogues, in businesses, Jewish businesses, when a gang of Gestapo men came to drag my father away, which they did. But my mother recognized one of the young men who came, an Austrian Nazi, who had been an errand boy in the family business, and she got furious. How dare you, she said, do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him back. Now, about 90 Jewish people were killed that night, but my mother, in Vienna alone, my mother wasn't, by a miracle, and by another miracle, the head of the pack of Gestapo people said, okay, bring so and so much money to Gestapo headquarters and we'll give him back to you. And so they did. And so the questions that arose in my child's mind were, does it have to be this way? Because I witnessed both, violence, insensitivity, cruelty, really. But I also witnessed what I today call spiritual courage, the courage of my mother to stand up to injustice out of love. And so when we have this capacity that my mother demonstrated for caring, for love, for standing up to injustice, why has there been so much cruelty, insensitivity, and violence? And years later, I found the answer to that. And I also found that there is an alternative. And there were no names, no terms for these patterns that kept repeating themselves, as I said, cross-culturally and transhistorically. And I called one the domination system and one the partnership system. And what I found is that societies that, if we look at them through the conventional categories of right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, religious, and secular, they're very, very different. I mean, think of societies that orient closely to the domination system. The Taliban, fundamentalist Iran, religious Eastern societies, right? But they're also both leftist and rightist Western societies that orient closely to that model. Hitler's Germany, Stalin's former Soviet Union, Putin's Russia. So the old categories really fragment our consciousness. And I found, and I'm going to stop in a minute, that actually gender, yes, gender is not just a women's issue, but as we see in the contemporary regression to domination, it is central to that model. Women have to be inferior to men, and there have to be very rigid gender stereotypes, no gender fluidity, nobody in between, even though there have been people, gay people, transgender people for millennia, really always. And so does family and childhood, which, if you notice, are not really taken into account in right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. It's very, very interesting, isn't it? But we know from neuroscience, nothing less than neuroscience, that what children experience and observe, especially in their early years before their brains, because we're not born, as you know, probably, with fully formed brains before their brains are fully formed, much less their critical faculties, that affects how well, it affects nothing less than the structure of our brains and how we think, how we feel, how we act, including how we vote, is influenced by our cultures, then as transmitted to most of us through families.
This is a perfect time to just sort of stop there, if I could. I'm sorry to interrupt you because we could listen to you all day. I just want to kind of bring us into a more general question. And you talked about the question you asked when you were young, does it have to be this way? And as I've worked with both you and Bill, you've kind of both asked the same question from different sides. You asked that one, and Bill, I've heard you say there has to be a different way. So I'd love for each of you to actually share a few words on how you see partnerism and bioregionalism or bioculturalism. How do they align as drivers of systems change through cultural transformation? So Bill, why don't we kick it to you, and you can give a little bit of your intro folded into your answer, if you will, and then Riane will hear from you.
Sure, glad to. First thing I should say is that I'm so honored to be in this same space, side by side with Riane, and there's my sort of history comes nowhere near the significance of Riane's, either in terms of sort of the history connected to the Holocaust, nor the history of contribution to human understanding. So with that caveat, I will say that some of what Riane mentioned, names, patterns, alternatives, cultures, each of those elements, I think there is commonality between bioregionalism on the one hand, or bioregioning, some people call it, to get into the names question or the words that we use, and the cultural transformation theory and partnership systems and domination systems. So I just mentioned the names side of things. I think that bioregionalism is a term that's been around for about a half century, a little more than a half century at this point. For those of you coming invited here from the Center for the Partnership Systems, essentially bioregionalism, dates back to millennia. The practice of engaging with our landscapes, our territories, our country, as they call it as Aboriginal peoples in Australia call it. Engaging with land in a way that looks at what Peter calls geographic terrain on one hand and terrains of consciousness on the other hand, or cultural terrains, if you will. That's the fusion that defines bioregionalism as it came to be named in the early 1970s. And more recently, the term bioregioning as an active verb that sort of focuses less on the thing of a bioregion and more on the act of regenerating our places in a bioregional way. That's sort of an evolution of language that ties in with what Riane has been talking about. Riane also mentioned patterns. That's something where we at R3.0 are looking closely at that. Eli, in fact, is a partner on our Bioregional Knowledge Commons work, which recognizes that there are practices that are very specific to a bioregion, to a place. There are practices that are inherent to that place. But then are there patterns of bioregional action that maybe cross or are similar across different place-based contexts? The question of alternatives is sort of the key element of your question, Eli, which really, to give a little bit of personal background, I spent the last 2 decades essentially pursuing the theory of transformation that powerful entities such as corporations or investors were the leverage point, to use Dana Meadows' language, to create change. And after 2 decades of engaging in that, I felt like that was no longer a successful route for me to pursue. And I feel like bioregionalism is, for me and for many others, a much more attractive and potentially successful mode of cultural transformation, to use Riane's language. So in other words, that we have to transform not just the physical and political systems that we're engaging in, but the cultural systems underneath that. So Eli, I'm going to leave it there. There's, as with Riane, there's much more that I could say about that, but I think I want to respect your value and kind of brevity and giving us both some time to talk about it, and then the time for the dialogue. So I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. So Riane, back to you. What's your response?
Well, I agree that bioregionalism is a transformative movement and that it entails cultural transformation. And that in turn entails, to start with, the transformation of consciousness. And I can attest to that personally, that it's possible. For example, I had no consciousness of gendered rankings. I just accepted that, so much so that after I graduated UCLA Law School, I went to work for what I wanted at the time, because the first part of my life was really, I was kind of lost and searching. What I wanted was to work for an entertainment law firm, and I did. I got a part-time job because I had little kids in a Beverly Hills entertainment law firm, and the head honcho called me into his office, and he wanted to compliment me. And he meant it as a compliment for having done good work on a case. And he said, "You don't think like a woman." And you know what? Not only did he mean this as a compliment, but I took it as a compliment, even though it's, of course, an insult. Well, that is really what bioregionalism is about, to paying attention, and I'm switching quickly to economics because...
Don't go there yet, Riane. That's another, we're going to get to that after.
Okay, well then I'll stop.
Okay, so all right, I'm going to jump in because the whole idea of patterns has come up, and Riane, in your partnership Domination Continuum, it describes cultural patterns, one of which is ranking or hierarchical ordering, but you also talk about actualization hierarchies in early cultures as well as in nature. And then Bill, I read in your recent Seeds report that you discuss class and elite overproduction as recurring reasons for societal collapse. So I want to like unleash the two of you to talk about your perspectives on hierarchy, and maybe even touch on whether or not you think they show up today, even in regenerative work. All right, let's see. I guess we're back to Bill. Take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks. Let me. So yes, Eli, I think that is spot on. We do mention this, and in fact, we quote Riane in Seeds on this actualization versus domination hierarchies. And a big shout out to Gaia Harrington, who's on the line here, and she's a steering board member of R3.0. She was one of the interviewees in the Seeds series, and she spoke at length about Riane's research. And so we ended up integrating that in our synthesis in the Seeds. So in the Seeds report, essentially what we do is we look at a series of different bodies of research that really align with and arguably were inspired by Riane's work in the Chalice and the Blade. In terms of first off, what is the lifespan? What is the life cycle of civilizations? And so, the research has come to sort of a consensus that the civilizations that we have seen all have a life cycle of rising and then collapsing, and to be very precise about it, Luke Kemp in the Goliath's Curse calculates it at an average of 336 years. So the key here is that civilizations rise and fall, and if you look at the defining element of civilization, and we quote Wikipedia here because that's sort of where you go for what's the consensus definition, what do most people think the definition is, and class hierarchy, so power differentiation based on class, is a defining element of civilization as we understand it now. And the other element of research that we appealed to was Peter Turchin, who's an emeritus professor here at University of Connecticut, near where I live, and his cliodynamic work. Cliodynamic just stands for the scientific study of history. So he does large database studies of history. And what he found was the most consistent dynamic in civilizational collapse is what he calls elite overproduction. So in other words, competition for limited political power, limited class hierarchical power, in other words. So the way that we distill this is that class differentiation or class hierarchy or domination hierarchy, to use Riane's terminology, defines civilization, and at the same time it is the downfall of civilization, because as their increase the number of elites competing to be in positions of power, that destabilizes the politics. And so essentially what we see here is that the modality of civilization that has emerged in the domination period of human history is a cycle of civilizational collapse. And the question that this raises in our minds is there an alternative? As sort of Eli, you framed things at the beginning. And we believe that there are alternatives to that. And we think that bioregionalism is a primary key alternative because it rejects a domination model and it embraces a partnership model. Does that mean that there are no hierarchies at all? Well, no. As Riane points out in the Chalice and the Blade, actualization hierarchies are actually healthy. We see them in nature. And so we essentially ascribe to Riane's differentiation between actualization hierarchies that are healthy and domination hierarchies that are unhealthy. So that's sort of a nutshell of what we're thinking. And I'm fascinated to hear what Riane has to say about that.
Well, I am delighted that you are incorporating this distinction, because what I'm talking about as partnership is neither working together, because in domination systems, there's this in-group versus out-group working together, right? And there are also, of course, these hierarchies of domination. But every society has parents, has teachers, has leaders. Once it gets more complex, has managers once it even gets more complex. So we can't just, if you will, throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have to redefine what power means. And it's very interesting because The Chalice and the Blade, which was the title of the first book that was published, that talks about these matters, really stand for two ways of looking at power, doesn't it? It's the blade is the power in domination systems, the power to dominate, the power to take life. The chalice is the power to nurture life, and yes, to illuminate life. And our interconnection, which is now being verified by science. I mean, two guys just got a Nobel Prize in physics for showing that at the subatomic level, there is entanglement, there is interconnection. And of course, we've known this, but again, it comes to us in such separate parts, separate messaging. I mean, think about how we're all interconnected genetically. Eve, right? That was her name, has our genes. But we just don't think of that. And these normative stories that we're taught, whether it's original sin or selfish genes, it tells us that we're selfish, we're bad, so we need to be controlled from the top, as in God fearing. And fear and violence and trauma is what holds domination systems together. Now, there is trauma, there is suffering in partnership systems too. There are earthquakes, we all die, we get sick, but we don't have to really build a social system that adds to this in all ways. Even the people on the top of the pyramid are nervous, aren't they? Because somebody might replace them, right? That is really a very tense way of living and making a living. And I guess you will ask me, Eli, soon about economics, because I wrote a whole book on that, The Real Wealth of Nations, and it's crucial. It is really crucial because we have this argument between capitalism and socialism, which is a distraction because both, well, I won't talk about this until you say economics.
Let me cue up one of your favorite topics for you. So what I wanted to say was, Riane, your work has focused on the hidden system of gendered values, where productive work is coded as masculine, reproductive work is coded as feminine, and it's completely undervalued. And you advanced the model of caring economics based on inclusion of care work and nature, among other excluded sectors in your model. And then, Bill, I know we've talked about, and you've written and studied and researched bioregional economics and economies that are exploring new ideas like import replacement, commitment pooling, and other bioregional currencies. And so, but these are still nested in an extractive system. So I'd love to kind of cut the two of you loose to talk about your thoughts on the emergent economic models and discuss even how we navigate the tensions between human needs and ecological limits without reverting to domination logics. All right, Riane.
Thank you. Well, look, I wrote a book which is available to all of you called The Real Wealth of Nations. And the subtitle is Creating a Caring Economics. And the thesis of that book is that, again, we're being distracted, right, to fight one another in, the conventional categories of socialism and capitalism, whereas actually both Marx and Smith really perpetuated. I mean, they both challenged a tradition of domination. Smith challenged mercantilism controlled by kings, right, and so-called nobles. And then came Marx, and he challenged control by the bourgeoisie. And his solution, albeit he said temporary, but still was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And of course, it was violent revolution. So we're right back to exchanging who's on top of the pyramid doesn't change anything, does it? It just puts somebody else in charge of the hierarchy of domination. And that's a lesson that we really need to internalize, by the way. But both Marx and Smith perpetuated, yes, what I call the hidden system of gendered valuations by calling, well, in their time, the work of caring, as it still is today, was coded feminine, so much so that it was to be performed for free by a woman in a male-controlled household, right? And as for the work of nature, the life-sustaining work of nature, which we are forced to finally focus on, there isn't a word in their writings about caring for our natural environment. Because after all, that's feminine, isn't it? So along comes, bioregionalism and says, but caring for our natural life support systems is vital, right? And I'm going to really say that if we don't change and have a reward for caring, be it monetary, because we do have currency, money is an economic invention. And once an invention is, so to speak, out of the bottle, you can't really push it back in. You have to utilize it differently, which I'm going to jump to AI. So I look at AI as both a crisis and an opportunity, because think about it for a moment. Intelligence, right, which we've equated with maleness, with left brain thinking, if you will, that is being challenged, isn't it? So what are men going to do? And of course, they're panicking because all this talk about AI taking us over means that, yeah, their superior, quote, intelligence is taking that away from men. So it's an opportunity, if you will, for us to have a more balanced intelligence. And of course, the balance starts with gender, doesn't it? And with the coding of care as, quote, feminine, both in economics and in our language. Now, when I published the Real Wealth of Nations, just putting caring and economics in the same sentence, it was like, oh my God. Well, today it's come in, but again, it's in bits and pieces without connecting the dots. And we have to really connect the dots if we're going to have, and we need the words, we need the terms, because again, if we don't have the terms for these two different systems, which are underneath very different societies, and by the way, and I'm being very nonlinear here, we have seen movement towards partnership, especially in the last 300 years, where one mass movement after another has challenged the same thing, domination. I mean, think about it. The Enlightenment challenged the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their, quote, subjects. Then came feminism, and it challenged the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule the women and children in the, quote, castles of their homes. The abolitionist movement then the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, challenged again the so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior races, all the way to the environmental movement, challenging, again, the so-called divinely ordained right of men, and it meant men, and that's what the translation says, man to rule over the rest of nature, which is taking us to an evolutionary dead end. And this is what I want to talk about. Really, I think that AI, as I said, is both a crisis and an opportunity. It is a way of changing one of the core elements, because think about it. If children grow up in a family that is domination oriented, they see that not only women, but the so-called feminine, the work of caring, is less than. And so they learn a fundamental lesson for domination systems, which is to equate difference, whether it's a difference in race, whether it's a difference in religion, whether it's a difference in gender, with not only superiority and inferiority and dominating and being dominated, but with being served and serving. And that runs through the whole system, doesn't it? And you're laughing because it seems so obvious, doesn't it?
No. Look, I could listen to you forever, but you can see everyone, Riane, her mind at 95 is like on overdrive. I want to give Bill a few minutes to sort of comment on the economics of bioregionalism, if just to kind of have the other half here, if you don't mind taking a few minutes.
Yeah, no, I don't mind at all. And in fact, I would want to riff directly off of what Riane was saying, or where we were all arriving here, which is that these ideas that we're talking about now are sort of common. They've entered our collective consciousness. I think Riane's work has a primary role in introducing and reinforcing these ideas to such a degree that now we can talk about these ideas in ways that we couldn't talk about them in 1987, for example. So I just want to say that what Riane is saying about words, names, about consciousness, this is important work that's been going on for quite a while. And so I want to tip my hat to Riane for doing that hard work. And the way that we're taking up on this and the bioregional movement is reflecting this work of cultural transformation. I would just point to a couple of things that you said in your question, Eli. So one of the things you said is balancing the tension between human needs and ecological limits. And I think that's sort of tied into what Riane keeps coming back to again and again, and what we focus on in our SIEGE report is this idea of supremacism, that there is, that humans, and particularly male humans, and particularly white male humans, are superior to nature, to women, to non-white people. And this is just not only poppycock and inaccurate and insulting, but it's also existential at this point. And so I think that an economy that balances the inherent tension between human needs. We must meet our needs, and that meeting our needs has ecological impacts, but those impacts don't need to be transgressing the ability of our ecological system to metabolize those impacts. Like that has been the way for millennia that human impact was metabolized by our ecologies. the question about nested within an extractive system. So we have an extractive economy that we're operating right now. And unfortunately, that's what we're working with. And so we at R3.0 have often talked about the challenge of operating successfully in an extractive economy without being extractive, while simultaneously planting seeds for an alternative economy that is not extractive. And so I think that's one of the things that bioregionalism, by working in place, can plant those seeds. So the elements that you mentioned, I'll just touch briefly on them. Import replacement, basically, our economies right now import primarily things that we can't get in our own bioregion, but even more so things that can be produced and delivered cheaper in economies that are more extractive and are more colonialist. And so that is not without ecological impact. And so import replacement is the idea that you replace things that you're importing right now that could be produced locally, that would reduce the ecological impact, that would enhance the local economy, and that would do its job in replacing the overarching extractive economic system that we're working in. Commitment pooling is an idea that we've, in particular focused on the work of, and now I'm spacing on his name, grassroots economics. Thank you. Of course, it spaces when I need it. The commitment pooling is drawing on practices that have been practiced on millennial scales by indigenous communities. Of instead of using money as an intermediation for commitments, in other words, agreements that we make with one another to meet each other's needs, that we can move more directly, that we can move away from the economic intermediation to the direct engagement of exchange and meeting each other's needs. That doesn't really do justice to the idea, but that's part of what we're looking at in bioregionalism. And then finally, bioregional currencies. The idea that right now our currencies are national scale and also global scale in terms of the economic system and the sort of the dollar being a predominant currency, but that is divorced from the ecological realities that underpin currencies. So currency is linked to ecological and social debt, you might say, that is completely disguised by our current currencies. So I won't say more about that because I think there's a question in the queue that might invite us to go deeper on that. The last thing I'll say about AI, because Riane put that into the room, and I would agree wholeheartedly with Riane that AI is this incredibly interesting double-edged sword where it both has existential risks embedded in it from the kind of political takeover of AI or of political elites right now through AI. To our cognitive and epistemological functioning, that it's literally breaking down human capacity for cognition, among many other things. And at the same time, we have people like Vanessa Andreotti who are doing hugely interesting work in AI, looking how, since we are saddled with AI at this point, how we can deploy it in ways that actually undercut these negative dynamics. So again, this doesn't do justice to the issue, but I figured I should probably at least weigh in on AI since Riane brought it up. So Eli, back to you. That's my attempt to address some of these issues.
amazing. I think it is clear we're going to have version 2 of this dialogue to get into a lot of different things. But I think it's a good time to bring in Michael Haupt's question, because the issue of money and currency came up. I'm just going to ask it. Michael asked, David Graeber in his book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, referred to the military coinage slavery complex. What are your thoughts regarding a bioregional monetary system as an alternative to the existing monetary system, and which bioregions are addressing this? Who wants to go first?
Well, I will defer to Bill because it is focused on bioregionalism, and he certainly knows much, much more than I do about it.
I'm glad to. And Michael, thank you for that question. I know that this question has some history, and that you're an advocate of alternative currencies to replace the currencies that we've got right now, for, I think it's safe to say, some of the reasons that I mentioned and others. So I think that I haven't read all of Debt, so I read enough of it just to be dangerous, I would say, perhaps. But my reading of Graeber's book was that he was basically saying that debt is something that has been with humanity since time immemorial, but that it has been weaponized, I guess I might say, and taken away from its original relational context. So I think that that's a vast oversimplification, but for the purposes of this answer, I think what it tees up is that I think that we can strive to return to the original understanding of debt as a natural means of human interaction with one another. And the idea of a bioregional currency being the mechanism by which we do that, I think has very strong promise, because a currency that is bounded by both the geography and the culture of a specific place has the opportunity to undergird and to represent the value that is specific to that bioregional context, and that it has the capacity, at least in theory, of recognizing the social foundations and the ecological ceilings, to use Kate Rayworth's language, of that bioregion as well. And so, to answer part of your question, Michael, I would point to, I happen to live in the Northeast Woodlands bioregion that has a long history of a local currency in terms of the Berkshires that was, in part inspired by the work of Jane Jacobs, and has been championed by the Schumacher Center for a New Economy. And that's sort of is a vibrant local currency in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. There's also, in the next adjacent sort of eco region, you might call it, the Connecticut River Valley, there's been work through Common Good Finance that similarly seeks to keep finance circulating within that eco region. And I'll just say, I'm not aware of particularly advanced implementation of bioregional currencies, and it may be out there, and I'm just not aware of it. But in the conceptual phase, we at R3.0 created a grant application for the National Science Foundation about 4 or 5 years ago that perhaps as expected got rejected. But it sought to pilot a bioregional currency that integrated the carrying capacity of that bioregion. So in other words, the social foundations and the ecological ceilings into the currency itself, so that the currency would reflect the carrying capacity of the region and would have developed mechanisms whereby the currency would only support economic interactions, transactions that respected the carrying capacity, social and ecological carrying capacity of the bioregion, and essentially took off the table transactions that right now are commonplace. So, transactions that transgress the carrying capacity are almost most of what we see. So at least in theory, there's some early work there. But Michael, I think that's a ripe area for development.
Could not agree more. I want to read a comment from Emmanuel. He said, great question. Hugo Bardi in his Substack today was evoking the ancient Chinese and others' dual currency system to limit corruption and a few grabbing all wealth and tying it up, creating debt for most others, and to focus instead on common goods and growth, well-being for all. I just wanted to give a shout out to that. And then Jordan asked a question. Let me put it out to you. There appears to be a convergence where to truly develop human partnerships in the local economy that are self-sustaining, that a global cultural understanding of power, gender, caring for nature, etc., all need to be addressed to reveal greater potential for authentic collaboration. Here's the question. How does one go about this, and is developing this relating the first step? Riane, do you want to take a first pass at that?
Sure, because I think that we're talking about consciousness of a partnership alternative, and that it's more pleasurable and that it's possible. And we have lacked that. I mean, most people are still under the misimpression that domination systems is all that there is and all that there can be. And, the caveman cartoon, right? In one hand, he's got a club, a weapon. With the other, very significantly, but not always noticed, he's dragging a woman by the hair, showing that what we call patriarchy, well, the alternative to patriarchy is not matriarchy. That's just the other side of the coin. There never was a matriarchy in prehistory. And really, that's shown by the figure that, the real alternative to patriarchy is partnership, of course. And if you look at the goddess figure that is that's the one constant among the three covers that the Chalice and the Blade has had through its existence, is the bird goddess. And it shows interconnection, not only between female and male, she's phallic in form and she has breasts, but between us and nature, she's a bird goddess, right? We are not used to thinking that way, and that is our heritage. So I think that now the issue of currencies is very complicated, by the way, I think, because unfortunately, alternative currencies have come and gone. And how do we change that? That is really one of the questions. They're very common in times of crisis, and certainly we're going through multiple plural crisis right now. But how do we ensure that we have an alternative currency that is based on partnership rather than domination? That's the question. And that gives adequate reward and value to caring for people, starting at birth, and caring for our mother earth, our natural life support systems. And you know that both socialism and capitalism exclude from their realm of economics the three life-sustaining sectors: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy and the household economy. You can work from dawn to dusk in the household, and it's an externality. As I said, a tree is not part of the GDP or GNP, but it is part of it when it's dead, when it's a log that can be traded. So everything is market-oriented, as were Smith and Marx. Because if you remember, women were excluded primarily from leadership and from most of the professions in the market. And women were not educated. I mean, we're not taught our history. That's the problem. Because of this marginalization of no less than the female half of our species.
Ron, you brought up the transformation of consciousness, and I would love to dig a little bit deeper there if you can. I know you've been working with Roger Briggs, who's been involved in this space. We know in general we need a consciousness raising, but in terms of sort of the evolution of consciousness, can you say a little bit more about how your work intersects with that?
Is this a question to Bill?
Yeah, to you actually, because you
to
had
me,
brought
but
up
then you have to
earlier.
repeat it because I assumed that it was to Bill.
No worries. Earlier, you had used the expression the transformation of consciousness, and I would love you to talk a little bit more about that. And I mentioned that I knew you were working a bit with Roger Briggs, who's all around, the evolution of
Yes.
consciousness. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that consciousness is the beginning of change. And without a transformation of consciousness, I mean, Einstein said it. He said, you can't solve problems with the same consciousness that created them. And Gandhi, another male who really influenced my work, he said, we must not mistake what is in our present considered normal with what is habitual. So this awakening of consciousness leads to action, and action leads to change. So it isn't just consciousness, it is what consciousness leads to. And you see that in all of these movements. They all were challenging domination without realizing it. And that is a failure of consciousness, a fragmentation of consciousness, which is by design, because we have inherited our conventional categories. Think about it: right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, from more violent times, from more authoritarian times. So it's time that we not just focus on one thing and another thing, but that we look at the whole system. And I had to, as you know, invent a whole methodology called the study of relational dynamics, which seeks to answer two questions. What kind of relations does a particular social system support or inhibit, but also what are the primary really foundations of both domination and partnership systems, and how do they work together to maintain the system. And my contention is that our progressive blindness to the importance of the gender hierarchy, which is so obvious, isn't it? I mean, but we're not taught enough about it, is an obstacle to change, because you cannot change the system. And notice, I mean, Trump, for example, said there are only two genders, and masculine and feminine are written in stone. There is nobody in between. And yes, one male is and masculine is ranked over female and quote feminine, and that is normal. Well, that is not normal. If for thousands of years it wasn't that way.
Can you talk a little bit about your research into the prehistoric cultures that you found where domination did not exist? It wasn't the prevailing modality.
Well, it is in the Chalice and the Blade, and I suggest that you get the latest issue of the book because it's still I've written a new epilogue that takes it up to the Trump years. But the thing about it is that there are polarities in nature, because this is a critique of domination and partnership, that there are polarities, but like hot and cold, like night and day, there are degrees, okay? But the the primary thing is that we are really, our education is siloed and split, and our consciousness is very much split by the available social categories. So changing that can really change. And I love this question of Megan. If domination has a strong root in trauma, what most promising and practical pathways do you see towards diffusing this and or shifting the dynamic back toward partnership, especially any possibilities you see for this in bioregionalism? Well, I think that bioregionalism is about cultural transformation. Um, and it's about many other things too, but it is about cultural transformation. So I see a really a wedding between them. And speaking of wedding, I think that we have to start with people where they are at. And it's not about blame or shame. It certainly isn't about blaming our parents because they just, like spanking. We had and I'm being nonlinear again, we had a virtual summit called Peace Begins at Home, connecting what we used to call domestic violence. I'm advocating for using the term family violence because that's what it is. It's violence in the family and the violence of war and terrorism, because believe me, there's a link, because this family violence normalizes domination and violence, doesn't it? Even the APA, the American Psychological Association, has come out recently saying that spanking is not only ineffective, but it is harmful. So there's a partial, but it's in bits and pieces rather than a systemic awakening. And I forgot your question by now.
You did great. I think the main takeaway, there are so many. You had a recent, very successful conference called Peace Begins at Home, and so much of your work reveals that it really begins in the family unit and then it spreads outward in society. Before we kind of approach our wrap up, believe it or not, I want to just highlight some of the comments that have come out around the economics. And I know that's a huge topic. We could devote a conversation to that alone. But I want to kind of give a shout out to Emmanuel and Tyler and Michael again. And I think Michael's comment might kind of wrap all of yours up. He said, my proposition for this dialogue is that national monetary systems are designed for contest Therefore, bioregionalism should prioritize partnership monetary systems. This to me is a core design requirement that needs more attention, and R 3.0 is uniquely positioned to bring this to the table. Thank you for that, Michael. Bill, let me just give you a few minutes to see if you want to respond to some of the comments around the economics and R 3.0.
Yeah, thank you, Eli, and thank you, Michael, for that comment. So I do think that this idea of bioregional currency or bioregional economics, or what some call bioeconomics, is very well positioned of the alternatives. So we can agree, based on the evidence, that our current systems are suicidal. But then the question becomes sort of what systems do we replace them with? And Michael, I saw your other comments that bioregionalism serves as an attractor towards, you say, those who have experienced a consciousness shift. I would say also those who are attracted towards, they kind of recognize the need for a consciousness shift, but maybe aren't quite there yet. And to be clear, I think the consciousness shift that is necessary is encapsulated in Riane's shift from a domination-based paradigm to a partnership-based paradigm. And so the idea of a partnership-based economy being, I would say, one element of a broader partnership-based culture is necessary. I appreciate the fact that you say that R 3.0 is well positioned to lead exploration around that. We certainly try to position ourselves as an entity that can support these kinds of exploratory early stage initiatives, and in particular that support the overarching bioregional movement. But I think I want to end by saying that I do think that bioregionalism is particularly well positioned. So it has the kind of attractive force, and it also is in some ways non-confrontational. It isn't a threat, if you will, even though at core it is a threat to the existing systems. But the idea that we would organize ourselves around our connection to place, that we would organize ourselves around the geographic and cultural features that define our lives anyway, is hard to dispute. So I do think that bioregionalism is well placed to enact some of these transformations in culture and in consciousness that I think most people agree are necessary. And now we're sort of looking at, well, what's the enactment mechanism for that? So I'll leave it at that, Eli.
All right. I don't know how to possibly synthesize this conversation. It's complex, just like the complex systems we're talking about. What feels most present is that it's not only a conversation about new systems, but deeper cultural shift from domination toward partnership, from abstraction toward relationship with place. And in that sense, bioregionalism is not separate from partnerism, but rather it's how those values actually become lived, embodied, and practiced in the world. We heard how hierarchy in of itself is not the issue, but whether it nurtures life or concentrates power, and that even regenerative efforts must pay close attention to how domination patterns can actually insidiously reappear. And this is especially, I think, important in our economic lives, where care of people, communities, and ecosystems must be made visible and valued if we're to build systems that truly sustain life. So I guess the last thing I would say is that this transition is not abstract. It begins with tangible steps, how we show up in our communities, how we support care, how we participate in local economies and governance, and that these small actions rooted in relationship are what will ultimately create systems change. So with that, I invite Riane and Bill to each share some closing remarks, and then Bill, it'll be back to you with your sort of housekeeping things. So Riane, do you want to give us a few closing remarks?
Well, there is so much to talk about, but the bottom line is we have the task of coming up with a more positive alternative to the present system. And that alternative, I called it partnership. That term actually came out of my experiences at that time, which was in the early 80s when I was working on this book as an attorney. At least in theory, a business partnership has mutual accountability, mutual responsibility, mutual benefit. I could have called it mutualism. It doesn't matter, but we need a word to connect the dots. And we can no longer really dismiss family and gender because we all live there. And frankly, the partnership alternative, as I can attest from my own life and my own personal life, my life with the social psychologist David Loy, who died 4 years ago, and I finally can talk about it without crying. 45 years together, they were the best years of my life because we supported one another. We cared for another. It really means so much. And that is not really possible in a domination system with its rigid gender stereotypes, right? And all of the problems. And as I really want to emphasize, this is not a critique of men as a group. Boys are traumatized by their socialization to become real men and to suppress not all emotions because they get anger and contempt, but the soft, quote, feminine emotions, right? Caring, caregiving, nonviolence. Well, that's not masculine, which is really suicidal, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So we really have to look at the entire system and see the connections. And one thing about bioregionalism, the danger is to fall into the trap that small is beautiful. And with all due respect, small can be very ugly. As you know, that you can have small communities that are completely domination oriented. So it's small and partnership oriented, smaller and partnership oriented. That is what we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Riane. Thank you really so much for joining us. Bill, do you have some closing remarks? And then we'll put it over to you.
Great. Yeah. I mean, the first closing remark is just such deep gratitude to Riane for sharing of your time and your body of work that is so phenomenally important, and to you, Eli, for facilitating with such finesse and grace. I guess when I look at the year of publication of the Chalice and the Blade, 1987. I was in college that year, and that's, I believe, the year that I was first introduced to feminism in depth in terms of studying it. And I had a real consciousness shift at that point. Like I had grown up in the domination society that we all exist in, and I had been enculturated into that and being exposed to feminism at that age truly transformed my life. I think that I've said it several times already, but I think that Riane's point about the power of naming, the power of creating a concept with words that we can use to understand it, that is what underpins the kinds of transformations that are necessary in physical reality, in physical systems as well. And so I experienced a consciousness shift that then shifted how I operated in the world. And so I guess I would leave with suggesting that degree of consciousness shifting that has happened over all of these years to bring us into the present. Now, I think we have the opportunity for bioregionalism as a mechanism, as a movement that can take these consciousness concepts like partnership, partnerism, like shifting away from domination, like cultural transformation, and enact them such that the sort of potential energy of these transformation is actualized into kinetic energy of change. So that's as eloquent as I can get to try to do justice to this conversation. And I will shift now into more mundane mode of sharing a few logistics, if you will. So final, thank you to Eli, thank you to Riane, thank you to everyone for the wonderful engagement that we've got. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the deck and share with you. Here we go, slideshow. And you can see my slides, I assume. So just a reminder that we've got a landing page for our open dialogues. I shared that earlier in the chat. And so that's where information lives. We will post a link to the recording and the deck and the living resources documents there for this dialogue. And then also we have our next dialogue. I was just waiting to post it online until we got the paper that this is going to be based on published, but it's not going to be released until next week. So we're going to go ahead and post this publicly so folks can start planning for it. But our next open dialogue is going to be on biohubs nourish bioregional metabolism, and that's going to be on the 16th of June from 3 to 4:30 UTC. I think that's 11 to 12:30 Eastern my time, if that's helpful. And I will post. We've already got the team up announcement for that, so I'll try and post that into the sidebar. But that's going to feature. Metabolic, the founding CEO Eva Gladek and the Strategic Initiatives Coordinator Serena Jury will present on their just released or about to be released white paper, Biohubs, Infrastructure for Resilience and Regeneration. And then they're going to be joined by Thais Corral from the Sinal do Vale in Brazil, which is one of the biohubs that's profiled in the paper. And they've been doing bioregional work down there in a bioregion that I'm not going to disrespect by mispronouncing it in Brazil. So that's our next bioregional open dialogue. So we'll be sharing information about that online shortly. The other thing to mention is we, of course, have the R3.0 conference September 8th through 10th. And that is focused on bioregional regeneration as collapse resilience, Earth-centric biocultural kinship, knowledge, and governance. And so we've got a website on that. Importantly, the bioregional confluence is a parallel process where we invite bioregional groups to gather in person to experience the online conference. And so we've already got 35 of these bioregional confluences registered across 6 different continents. And we recently, actually, I can't give details right now. I will be able to shortly, but we've got an infusion into the Confluencing Fund. And so in order to qualify for a fair share portion of the Confluencing Fund, you just need to register your expression of interest by the 31st of May. We'll still allow confluences that register after that to have free access to the conference, but just not a share of the Confluencing Fund if you come in after May 31st. For that confluencing community, we have ongoing calls on a monthly basis where we spotlight a specific bioregion. So this last month was the Northeast Woodlands. That's the bioregion I'm in, and we spotlighted the work of the Northeast Woodlands Bioregion Collective, the Intertribal Alliance, and the Lake Champlain Adirondack Confluence that's anchored at the University of Vermont. The next one is going to be happening in 2 days from now, on Wednesday. It will feature Danilo Olivas and Samara Tanaka from the Marumbi watershed in the Cerro do Mar bioregion of Brazil, speaking about their education association and school there as a mechanism for bioregionalism. So you can, if you register to become a confluence, you're immediately added into the confluencing community and can join these monthly calls. I mentioned the Confluencing Fund. We've recently gotten infusion, but we invite all donations to that, and you can find a link to the donation page on our website. And so I think that rounds things out. I'll stop the share and just again say thank you to Riane, thank you to Eli, and thank you to all of you for attending and engaging so vibrantly in this bioregional open dialogue. Cheers.
Thank you, Bill.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Riane. Bye.
thank
Stay
you.
well. Stay well. Bye.
Thank you again, Riane.
Thank you again, all of you.
I'll talk
And
with you
thank
soon,
you,
Riane.
Eli and Bill, so much.
My
It
pleasure.
was an honor.
Yeah.